is Malika Basdav. Welcome to PM Express. It's been quite a while. Today we bring you another brilliant young professor. He is the first black African to be appointed academic director at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's also a professor of finance in this same university. My guest today is Professor Paul Alagidede. Prof, welcome to PM Express.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Good to see you
Good
too.
to see you.
Yeah,
and
it's a pleasure.
I have a certain familiarity with you because you have classmates whom I know. Our own Samson Ladi and Yenini, and of course my friend James Agalga.
Correct.
They are your friends.
Correct.
You grew up in Navrongo.
Correct.
And you went to Navasco. Tell us about life in Navasco.
Navasco has always been a school that will stay in my heart.
You guys call yourself Nabia?
Nabia. Nabia simply means the Nabia refers to the crown of the cow, the head of the cow, and it's actually a symbol of power, authority, and strength.
Okay.
And our motto is Lux Borealis, which actually means the light of the north. So Navrongo Secondary School, which I went from. The
Damascans and the guys who went to Notre Dame will fight with you over this one.
They will argue, but we know our place. So we're still the light of the north, and Navasco has produced many souls of this land, and I'm very privileged to have passed through that great institution. And life there was very interesting. I think all my intellectual faculties actually started developing from that side, and having been able to come from that environment, it was much easier to fit in any other environment there.
Yeah, we will talk about the environments that you transitioned into. Yes. But you had classmates as Samson,
correct.
James Agalga. What other notable classmates in Navasco at the time, if you remember them?
Navasco, there's so many of them. In fact, a lot of them still in Ghana at the moment. I can mention offhand Hakim. Obviously, he works at the electricity ECG. And who else? Seth Badu, Williams Chanaire. These were all great people that we all shared life, and we've remained friends ever since.
What was the funniest thing for you in secondary school?
It's a dining hall story. So
and it always has to be dining hall story.
That's right. So I was, at our time, I was the senior prefect. Agalga was the assistant senior prefect.
Oh, okay.
And we were like the tiniest boys in that
and
year
the sharpest
group.
Boys too.
Well, I don't know about that, but
well,
we were very
senior prefect, and
yes.
what you have done for yourself and what he is doing for himself.
Correct.
He's a lawyer, you are academic finance professor.
Yeah.
It tells.
Sure. So a lot of the things had to do with managing students who are more bulkier than you and probably more intimidating than yourself. So to be able to do that at that stage was really one of the remarkable things that Agalga and I did. And I think our colleagues had great respect for what we stood for
so
then.
Tell us about the funny stuff.
So dining hall, it's usually the time food charging. I don't know whether you've heard of the term.
Yes.
Yeah, charging is when people throw themselves on the food and everybody is scrambling to get his chunk of food, and it was a rampant activity. Of course, it's always punishable when you are caught, but to get the person who set it off is usually the most difficult. So yeah, somebody shouts charge, and then it's like a pandemonium. People run from the classrooms, from the halls of residence.
And they train themselves on the food.
On the food, and it can be really a very, very messy situation. The food gets split, scattered all over the place. And as a senior prefect, you must always ensure that everyone is well fed. and not a few group of strong boys should be able to take the food away from.
And the senior prefect and his deputy are the tiniest boys in the
That's correct,
school.
yes. So to be able to control that crowd, it's one of the most difficult things. Okay. And of course, when dining hall time, it's the time to really show off. So,
of course.
So I still remember my big words. Some students know me up to now for the big English words. That's what you use to calm the crowd, and it's usually.
And then you get everybody's attention.
That's right. So I mean, it was the most liveliest environment that I've ever lived in.
So what did you do in secondary school in terms of course?
I studied history, geography, and economics, and I studied economics and throughout thereafter. So yeah, that was. So
you went to the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology straight from Navasco.
Correct.
Which year was this?
In 1998. We entered the university in 1998.
Okay.
So we completed secondary school in 96, but there was a 2-year wait because of the 1994 strike action of university lecturers. Anyone who left high school that time will have to wait for the backlog. So we had to stay at home for 2 good years, between 96 and 98. And we got to first year in 98.
Okay, yeah. So you entered KNUST in
1998, August 1998.
So what was the university life like?
It was also very interesting. I have always liked the idea of studying, and I take studying to be one of my hobbies.
Was that something you picked from home? What kind of home did you grow up in?
Growing up, there were a lot of teachers around me. My aunties and uncles, most of them. In fact, the most prominent figure you find in my background was normally a teacher.
Okay.
So I think that's...
Which is a common theme.
Yes. It was very much a strong influence on my life. So and the next step is to graduate. Normally we used to move from Navasco to Bosco, St. John Bosco's Training College, which is just next door.
Okay.
So the motivating factor is always to get into the teaching profession, and I think it's much easier to get into. And teaching is also very valuable in terms of impacting knowledge. So
which is why you became a professor.
Yeah.
So at home, were your parents educated? Because you talked about aunties.
Correct. Yeah, my direct parents weren't so educated. So my dad wasn't the really highly educated person. So it's my mom. She was in mostly petty trading most of the time. But they were the real economists. Later on, I found out it was those people like my mother who never stepped in the classroom that actually taught me the first principles of economics. How to run a home and a family, and to take care of boys like myself to get to where I am today.
Okay, so you completed, so do you have siblings?
I do have, so we're 6, I have 3 brothers, 2 older ones, 1 younger one, and then I have 2 sisters.
Okay, they're all in Ghana?
Yes, all in Ghana.
Okay.
Probably the only one still roaming around the house.
Okay, so you grew up in Navrongo?
Correct. So I was actually born in Kumasi in Asukwa, and then my parents were down south around that time in the late 70s, and we moved back to the north around the early 80s. And so I grew up there. After I grew up almost all my life in the north.
So after university, how did you get to go to South Africa?
So I left Ghana in 2003 after my national service to study in England on a scholarship. So I went to Loughborough University and studied for my master's and PhD. And then I stayed back and worked for 3.5 years in the UK. And somewhere along the line, I think I made a promise to myself that if I ever were to study abroad, and I will return home and work. So late 2008, 2009, I was here to see if there were any opportunities for me to come back home and work. And obviously, I've chosen academic work as my profession, and it turned out that there weren't so many vacancies.
So you had to run back.
That's right. So I was looking around really there was something in me that wanted me to return to Africa, whichever country it was. And Ghana, being my birth country, was my first choice. So it turned out there weren't vacancies at the time I was planning to return. And the most vacancies opened up in South Africa, and that's how I ended up. I went to Rhodes University as an associate professor in 2011, and 2 years after that I got appointed at University of the Witwatersrand as a full professor of finance.
Let's go back to the UK. So the Navrongo boy,
yeah.
who from Pungu, a village in around Navrongo,
yes.
Who woke up one morning and he's in the United Kingdom. What was that transition like?
It just didn't happen once. It was stages of events that led to that. Okay. I think when I entered university, my aim was to study to the highest level that I could ever go. And so my thinking was, if I could do a bachelor's degree, then I could equally do a master's.
Okay.
And so when I enrolled in a master's, I said, well, if there's another stage, then I could do a PhD. So when I completed my bachelor's in Ghana, I think I had such a strong impulse to study abroad. And all I did was to ensure that I make the required grades that will land me a scholarship, whatever it takes. So I think my path has always been to try and figure out what are the boxes to tick, and put all my energies in ticking those boxes. So I completed with the first class at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And thereafter, I channeled all my efforts looking for scholarships abroad. And in 2003, I was very fortunate to be one of the few to be awarded the Department for International Development's Shared Scholarship Scheme, which is the DFID. Yeah. So that took me to my master's. But the moment I arrived in England, I was not even thinking about the master's, but the next stage, and that was the PhD. So that's my path. So it wasn't one step. But I also look back and see that some of the things that got me there was purely on the basis of the kinds of thoughts that I entertained in my mind. I remember looking back in one of my high school books, and I'd written the type of universities I was going to attend abroad. That was way back in high school.
Way back in Navasco?
Yes. I was quite surprised about what I wrote myself, and it turned out to be exactly what I got into.
Wow.
And so it has taught me something about how to look at life in a different way, that your thoughts create whatever reality that you see. And if you can put the right thoughts in your mind and focus on them and pursue them through to the end, the universe always delivers what you ask for.
Absolutely. So you left the UK, came back to Ghana, and then back to South Africa.
Yeah.
And you are the first black African to be appointed academic director in the University of Witwatersrand. What does that mean? What do you do as academic director?
So the statistic, I'm not very sure, because when I arrived, I didn't know who was there before myself. But yeah, for the past few years that I've been there, that has been the trend. Okay. So there was a sudden change in the leadership of the Wits Business School. Okay. And a lot of resignations had hit the university. Okay. And I got in as a pure academic. I want to stay with my books and stay with the students that I'm mentoring, PhD students and master students. And it just dawned on me that after the resignations, vacancies have been created and people have to step in. Initially, I hesitated because when I was approached to fill the position, I thought that wasn't one of the things that I wanted to do. So, I know about academic administration. It's meetings upon meetings and things like that. So, but I also, after a few days of reflection, I thought it was also an opportunity to serve in another capacity. So being academic director simply means that you lead in the academic programs and project, course designs, who teaches what, who fills what position in the university, and what types of students to get into the university, and the entire spectrum of planning and running the university in a very efficient way of delivering quality knowledge and the kind of relevant knowledge that society requires to develop. So in sum, that's the main thrust of the academic director
and
position.
you are at the graduate school
Correct.
of the business administration.
Yes.
And you are professor of finance. I guess the biggest challenge that Ghana and Africa are confronted with is the management of finance. In what you do, how do you see Africa dealing with that problem?
So you put it rightly. It's part of the problem that we face in Africa is about management of finances, but it's much more deeper than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the finances, I think, is just the facade of the building, and the actual nut and bolt issues are the structural issues that we face as economies that are trying to grow or that are growing. So some of those issues, cut across all kinds of spectrums, from politics to economy and social, environmental, and the rest. But to answer your question directly, I think there's also a new resurgence in the way in which we are looking at the African path of development. Part of it has been through negative programming. The African has been told time and time again how bad he is, how undeveloped he is, and how he cannot get out of the circumstances that he has found himself. So I think getting the management right will be for the African to rediscover who he really is. This is something we've lost somewhere along the line.
Have we not proven it? Or it is an uneducated opinion?
Sometimes an opinion can be put to you, and you can accept it and act on it unknowingly, and that becomes your reality. It doesn't mean that it's true. So if everything that has been said about us, about that continent and underdevelopment and everything that we have accepted seem to be the case, it doesn't necessarily prove anything from my point of view. So sitting here, we've got an opportunity to refocus all of those types of
There are documented evidence of billions and billions of dollars which seep into people's pockets, money which ought to have gone into the building of infrastructure, building of economies, provision of water, electricity, and other things that would make life better for the African people. And African leaders are on record, it's documented, as having dissipated all of this money through mismanagement of finances. That is not anybody's creation. That is not a figment. It's not just put in our minds. That is reality.
I agree with you, no doubt about that. What I'm saying is that in the midst of that, it's also the positive side that we can do better. What you said is very true, that people we put in places of confidence and trust tend not to deliver what we want from the outcomes that we get. And I think there's also a reawakening of many people to the fact that the kind of politics and economics that we have followed in the past has not necessarily helped us. The corruption, mismanagement, and all of that, the ills that we don't want continue to bedevil and stall our progress. But there is a way out. And I don't want to be repeating the story, the programming that I talked about, which is the negativity that has been programmed into our minds, which we have accepted. And that is what we act out, by the way. It is something that we are acting out. It is an effect of something that has been ingrained in us. So the average African typically hasn't got enough confidence in what he can do and what he should do. And this is where the story, I believe, should start from. We focus too much on the effects of what we are experiencing. The effects is poverty, mismanagement, corruption, and all of the other ills are effects of a fundamental negative programming. That is my viewpoint.
Is this not the typical bright academic shifting the blame on somebody else or some other grouping rather than looking at his people and saying, this is what we are doing wrong, we must change?
I'm not necessarily making a case for what is happening. I am only saying that in the midst of that, there is a way out. Okay. Remember, the story that we have been told is what we are discussing right now. Okay. It is just one directional. It is negative, it is stinking, it is rotten, and this is what is being repeated over and over again. I'm saying that having a different chorus might give us a different energy. And why I'm saying this is that Africa is poised to be the next continent to lead the world. And for this to happen, we must look within ourselves. We are to blame for everything, every single thing that happens to us. To accept negative programming is your own choice. We have the choice not to accept what is being dumped on us, or to even accept the negativity that we carry on ourselves. So I do agree that some of the problems that are created are right here within us. We created them, and we must think out of them. That is my point.
My guest is Professor Paul Alagidede. He is a professor of finance at the Graduate School, University of Witwatersrand. I struggle to pronounce that. It's in South Africa. When we come back from the break, I will continue with this discussion. I will be asking him, how can we deal with the problems of finance? You're watching PM Express. Keep watching. You're welcome back. You're watching PM Express, and we are talking to Professor Paul Alagidede, finance professor. And when we are talking finance, you know, we are talking money and the management of it. Prof, in the earlier discussion, you talked about the valuable lessons that you drew from your mother's small business and the principles thereof. Do you see African economists, and you are an economics person, do you see African economists applying those principles?
I think it's a must that we go back to the basic principles of economics, which is at the household level. Our mothers have done this perfectly well. And if the economy is an aggregation of the smaller units into a bigger picture, then there's no reason why we cannot do that. Typically, in an African home, you find these mothers like myself, my own mother, who never went to school to study any principle of economics, knowing how to put food on the table. This is a basic function. How to manage the home finances, how to not get into debt, and how to put all the kids in school, even under very trying circumstances. This is happening in various homes. So it's baffling that we cannot replicate that at the top level, because what it's the aggregate economy is also what is the micro base things. And I think for some reason we have failed to get that right at the top.
What do you think is to blame for that? Is it the education, or is it cultural, or what? I
will attribute it to lack of understanding. For myself, I don't see why I will ever want to spend money that I don't have. This is a basic principle. We work on the principle of balance. The whole universe is based on the principle of balance, and that's it. So if you don't have any finances or money or cash, of course you can borrow in the short term, but we know that continual borrowing without taking care of the gaps will eventually yield a problem for you.
So when you hear that the government of Ghana in a particular year, say 2012 or whatever year, I think 2012 specifically, budget deficit was 12% or even higher. As a finance person, how does that make you feel? And as a Ghanaian?
Well, look, if you look at the implications of it, it can be very serious in many ways. And it's simply, as I keep saying, it's a reflection of some distortion somewhere. And so when you look at budget deficits, it's simply that you are spending something that you don't have. And this is an issue. So how do you keep on spending money that you don't have? And these are questions that we should put to ourselves. Individually, we don't do that normally, or if we do it, we don't do it to the extent in which our nation is doing it. But remember, there's political economy issues play a very big role in terms of managing the economy. So a lot of expenditure will typically not be economically wise. As an individual, you probably won't do them, but maybe as a politician, you might want to do them for short-term gains. So all these things play a very big role. And I've been looking at this particular phenomenon with some of my students, PhD students, looking at budget cycles, political budget, business cycles, and how in election years you tend to get these type of unusual spikes in public expenditure, some of it largely unproductive. And we need to begin to address some of those issues. And sometimes you cannot blame politicians alone, because individuals are gunning for all kinds of services in an election year, which they must deliver if they need to get the votes. So these types of different permutations of voter wishes and politician wishes of getting into power tend to lead to a lot of mishaps. And subsequently, you need to pay for all of these.
Then there's no end in sight, because the politicians would continue to clamor for power, and the people will continue to clamor for development. And as long as these things persist, then there is no end in sight to the cyclical problem of deficit.
So it comes to an awakening where people, or both sides, will see that driving the economy this way hasn't helped. It hasn't helped, and it will not help going forward. And this is the type of awakening and the story that I have to tell most of the time. A lot of the things that we are doing now are not necessarily new, because some other societies and groups have gone through the same cycle and come out of it successfully. So my message is we can learn from some of the experiences of how other countries or other groups or societies have dealt with these very primary problems that we are facing. Budget deficits can be tackled fairly easily when we live within our means, and when we do not necessarily blow up expenditures of a frivolous nature.
And like you said, budget deficit simply means we are spending money we don't have. How does that affect us nationally, individually?
Let me correct this. In the first instance, not all deficits are bad, by the way, because sometimes the government borrows to maybe spend on some kind of capital goods, like building factories or schools, and maybe putting the roads in order, and types of things like that. So in the short run, you may incur a deficit, but subsequently you expect that the returns from these types of investments will yield an appreciable return that will help you pay your way out. But the type of deficit that is problematic is when it's mostly financing recurrent expenditure. You see, type of things that do not regenerate any income. We typically borrow to service interest on previously contracted loans, or just to pay emoluments and wages and salaries, and of a recurrent nature. Sometimes, I use this example, we have two broadly types of borrowing. You can borrow proactively or reactively. Now, the reactive type of borrowing is where you borrow to finance expenditures that are of a dodgy nature. Example, if you take a loan of, say, 1 billion Ghana cedis, and half of this goes into celebrating your president's birthday, for example. It's a very crude example. you're never going to get that money back. Or just say, throw it in some kind of short-term project that is not going to yield a return. That is a kind of reactive type of borrowing. You're expected to pay the principal with some interest, and that puts a lot of strains and stresses on the economy. But the proactive type of borrowing, which is channeled towards developmental projects like a hydroelectric dam or even a nuclear power plant or a factory, for instance, it's useful both the short and the long run in terms of increasing the economy's capacity to grow and absorb the people who are currently unemployed, and therefore be able to add to the growth rate of the economy. So we must be very cautious of the types of borrowing that we do. I think the way forward is towards the proactive type.
You are in South Africa, but I suspect that you follow developments back home keenly,
Correct.
especially as they relate to borrowing and the management of the economy and finances. All the Euro bonds that we have taken, dating back to 2007, and all the domestic borrowing, and the arguments that dominated the last election about borrowing, do you think we have demonstrated that when we borrow in a manner which is proactive?
Sometimes the initial documents tend to depict that way, but eventual implementation and use of the funds show something else, especially if you do a very serious national audit on the type of activities that we spend the borrowed funds on. And this is the problem, because you can argue for an infrastructure fund, which you go to external markets to seek the money for, but if the money is not applied in the right way, or if it's applied in the right way, but there are a lot of leakages, which we tend to also find, and that the exact sums do not go to take care of the precise type of things that we are hoping or seeking to do, then you tend to have problems. So that is one big issue with the types of borrowing that we have. The other thing is that we normally rush into these international capital markets when we have exhausted all opportunities. Of course, borrowing almost puts the domestic economy under very severe stress, so you want to look outside. And because you haven't managed domestically or economic fundamentals well, you get slapped with very high rates of return on your borrowing. So some of the loans we are attracting internationally are not necessarily cheap, and that is another issue.
And talking about the cost of borrowing, I think the biggest problem for many Ghanaians and for many governments over many, many, many decades is the cost of borrowing in Ghana.
Correct.
You live in South Africa. If I were to pick a loan in South Africa of, say, $100 or $1,000, what interest would I pay on it?
The base rate is currently around 9%, so 9.25%.
9.25%.
That's just the normal that you get. Of course, each bank will now have to work out the risk profile of the individual doing the borrowing, and that may add another 1 or 2%. But usually, that's you get around 9 to 10% roughly. And that's what
in Ghana, you know how much one would pay?
Yes.
Between,
yes,
between 27, 28, 30, 35. In some cases, it's way higher than that. Because all these, so many microfinance companies are actually giving out money, and they're taking, say, 5% a month.
I mean,
and that rakes up to 60+% in a year.
So the cost of borrowing is a big issue. I've got friends in the Bank of Ghana who have done a lot of work in this area. Now, some people have argued that the interest rate is actually not sensitive to investment in an economy like Ghana. So you can drive interest rates up to the roof, but it's not really the primary driver of the kinds of things that people use the funds for. So other things like the cost of doing business become very paramount. I'm not saying that the cost of borrowing is reasonable. It is very high and unacceptably so. Not only in Ghana,
but
but
why
mostly.
is that?
Yeah, the banks are in the business to do business, so to speak. So they will want to get a decent return for every dime that they give out. And this is a function of the type of risks that you face in the economy. So in our economy, the cost of doing business is not cheap. So you're talking about infrastructure bottlenecks, transporting common raw materials from the farms to the industries. It's not an easy thing. So that is a very huge risk for businesses. And on top of that is the electricity challenges, which I think we have managed to stem the tide now, if temporarily. And then so many other kinds of risks that play. And on top of that are the other things, the opportunities where you actually spend these resources when you do get the borrowing, the funds. So those kinds of activities are presumed to be highly risky. If I borrow to go into farming, and that's presumed to be a very risky business. The weather can fail. We still largely depend on rain-fed agriculture. Yeah. So the weather can fail you. If it doesn't, in the north, places like vegetable growing, places like Tono and Via and the rest, if the weather doesn't fail, you can get insects attack, and in a year that can kill your crops. If that doesn't happen, you can get a glut, especially in the tomato season. Absolutely. From Akumada and all those areas where people commit suicide because there has been abundant harvest. So these are some of the primary things that we need to really be paying attention to, and they are not very difficult things to fix, so to speak.
Why have we not fixed them?
For that, I think it goes beyond the type of things that I do in the political economy. So people like myself can talk about them. We can write very good papers and show you what to do. And somebody else has to take it from there. And there has to be the will to want to change and the will to...
You are in Ghana, and you are precisely at GIMPA.
Yes.
And you are here for the African Review of Economics and Finance Conference.
Correct.
What is that about?
So this conference started last year at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. That was our first conference, and this is the second major conference. The African Review of Economics and Finance came out of our journal called the African Review of Economics and Finance Journal. Okay. This is a journal that I started with some of my colleagues about 8 years ago. Franklin Obing Odum, senior lecturer based at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Dr. George Adu, who is based at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Okay. At the time we started, the idea was to provide a platform for young academics to publish papers. This was one of the things that I discovered as a student in my graduate school days, that getting content, research content on Africa into the regular journals was very difficult. So the idea was to provide a journal that will focus on African research. So it goes back to some of the things that I've talked about. The programming that Africa has had over the past hundreds of years. Okay. And I'm not making this as an excuse for the African underdevelopment program, but I'm saying that it's a contributory factor to it. To the extent that when you write an academic paper and you want on Africa, using African data, for example, and you wanted to publish it in a very good journal out there, sometimes you get rejected, not because the work is not good, but simply because it is on Africa. And this is something that we sought to correct from the get-go. I had that experience myself.
Tell us about that.
Yes, so it was 2007, I still remember correctly, and I don't want to mention the journal's name, but this is what happened. I sent a paper out which was written based done on Ghana Stock Exchange. Okay. And the reviewer, the editor came back and said they were not publishing the paper because Ghana is too insignificant a market to merit the attention of the readers of the journal. Now, that was the basis of the rejection. Now,
simply that?
Yes.
That Ghana doesn't count as far as their readership is concerned?
Correct. So their readership is not interested in a small market like Ghana. Now, so for somebody like me who is interested in studying a market like Ghana, where do I get my research published? And this is where the idea of the African Review of Economics and Finance was muted.
Okay.
And so I'm still the founding editor-in-chief.
Yes.
And so I started it with these two colleagues of mine, Franklin Obingodum and then George Aduan. And we have grown since then. It was an experiment of trying to provide an alternative platform to engage the African academics, both on the continent and in the diaspora, to find an alternative avenue to publish their work. And we have done that for the past 8 years creditably well. We've published work on South Sudan, work on Lesotho, countries that probably will never appear in any of the very top journals in economics and finance.
Because they are regarded as insignificant.
Correct. So if Ghana can be insignificant, you can imagine what happens in the other smaller countries which are not even on the map like Ghana is. So this is how we started, and we have seen an explosion in our growth. The network has grown. The number of people who have published with us has also grown.
Prof, we have to take a break. When we come back, I want to explore how this is helping young African academics and how it is supporting the agenda to help others get their research works published, and what this conference is intended to achieve. You're watching PM Express. I'm talking to Professor Paul Alagidede. Keep watching. And we are talking to Professor Paul Alagidede. My colleagues like his name. I will ask him to explain what the name means. So, Prof, Alagidede, what does it mean? What language is that?
So, from the Kasana language,
so
from Pungutelania, it simply means I want plenty. That's the literal meaning.
Okay.
But you know, when our people give names, they just don't focus on the literal meaning.
Okay.
There is a symbolic meaning to it.
Okay.
And my interpretation is that I want more knowledge, I want more people, I want anything that is good. The more of it, the better. So,
because the name is I want more.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. So that's the meaning.
Yeah. So you were talking about the Africa Review of Economics and Finance
conference
journal.
In the journal.
Yes. So you're talking about how the journal has grown.
Yeah. So there has been an explosion in the growth of the journal. Actually, if you look out there, you find the latest volume. We're now publishing in the region of 10 papers per volume, which is quite remarkable. So I thought that if we can have a platform like a conference where people can actually get out of the university and research institutes and meet at least once a year and see each other. Sometimes it's very easy to sit in the ivory towers and write things, but if we can meet and discuss and see how we can motivate each other. So this is really a platform for engagement between the young and upcoming academics, those who are actually aspiring to be, and those who are already well established. So you see in our keynote, we try to invite very senior professors to come and give a keynote speech on a specific issue for all of us to relate and discuss and further enlarge our knowledge and experiences in. So we've been attracting people from all over the world.
So who is giving this the keynote speech?
So there are two keynote speakers for this particular conference. Professor Karim Abadia, he just retired, one very young Egyptian professor based at Imperial College in London. He just took an early retirement, so he will be talking to us today on the main theme of the conference, which is looking at macroeconomic shocks and external imbalances. I have known him since 2006, and he has worked on a lot of things, looking at how recessions happen and how to track the turning points in an economy before the recession actually hits. And he has a model that actually predicted the last recession.
The 2007 one?
Yes, yes. Now he is, I was telling people, he is a very shy person, not one of those who went to the media to say all kinds of things about how accurate they were. But we are very fortunate to get him to speak to us on those turning points. And that would be very crucial for us because our economy also goes through those kinds of cycles. And if we can catch the turning point before the crisis hit, it will be a very good tool for policymakers to think about what are the appropriate responses. And then we also have Professor John Asafo-Adjei, who is a Ghanaian but based in the University of Queensland in Australia. And he will be giving us the second talk on the oil discovery, 10 years after Ghana's oil discovery. What have we done with the revenues and what can we do better in terms of the management? So
what do you think we have done with the revenues?
I haven't seen the money yet. So not much of it have I seen, so it's very difficult to comment on that. But some of my colleagues are working on it. Dr. Franklin Obing-Odum is a very keynote expert in the oil industry in Ghana, and he had spent a lot of time in Sekondi Takoradi actually studying the fundamentals of what is happening there. And then Professor John Asafo-Adjei has also done extensive work on it. So I think there's still room for us to improve in terms of what we are doing with the money.
And this is a two-day conference?
Yes, two-day conference. Yeah. It's also a venue for prospective students who are looking to maybe further their education, master's, PhD, to also come here and meet people who are already in the field. So this is really a very friendly forum. And the idea is that after this conference, we call it African Review of Economics and Finance because we have the entire continent in our mind. So we've had the first two here, we're looking to move to another African country, and then we will rotate across the different countries as we go on. And
I know you said you haven't done any much work on oil. Yeah. When you follow the arguments that about the management of the oil resources and we put so much money in capacity building, organizations which are supposed to monitor how the oil resources are being used are not being funded to do the work, and PIAC comes to mind, the Public Interest and Accountability Committee. They complain that they are not being funded. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to always hear these stories, especially as a Ghanaian living outside. And I think we can do better with what we have got. And that is what I can say for now. We need to understand the nitty-gritties of the oil industry. As developing countries, it will interest you to know that you may have the resource located in your soil, but in terms of the actual utilization, very little of it gets back. And it's true for almost all our raw materials, not only oil. So taking possession of what we own and using it in the proper way, I will argue it should be the way forward.
I met a Tanzanian lady who said that Africa everywhere is the same in terms of management of resources. Is that a view you share?
Not necessarily. I think there is so much diversity in Africa, even in terms of the management. The negativity seems to cut across, but there are very good stories that we never get to hear about Africa. So I do not subscribe to that view. Even in Ghana, I think there is much good that is taking place that doesn't get into the normal channels, and people like yourself in the media will be champions of putting the negative, dim light.
I just got accused.
Yeah, no, not really. You hold such a very powerful position that whatever you communicate out there really has a very big impact. And so for all of us, and including myself, wherever we have the opportunity to put something out there for people to digest, we should think very carefully. It doesn't mean that we should shun from pointing out the bad that is going on, but we should also highlight a lot of the good that is going on in Africa that never get aired.
Prof, are you married?
Yes, I am married.
Ghanaian?
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh,
my wife is, yeah, she's Ghanaian.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Sala girl from...
okay. It's a Sala girl from,
yes,
from
yes, so
the Upper West
yes,
region.
yeah, she's a medical doctor, and we live together in Johannesburg.
Where did you meet her?
I met her at KNUST.
Oh, okay, so she was also a student.
Yes, but junior, I left university long before her, so, but I came back to Ghana in 2006, and that's where I met her. And,
we often hear that academics are not very romantic. Would you consider yourself?
I don't know what romantic means. So I'm not sure what. All I know is just being a normal human being and being yourself. And if that is what being romantic means, then... I'm
not sure that's what she would classify as being romantic.
Yeah. What do you mean by being romantic?
So, any kids yet?
We're expecting a baby soon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
In advance. So, she's in South Africa?
Yes, yes. So, she's a medical doctor.
What was the first thing you told her when you met her?
Do I remember? It was just an informal chat. And, you know, she's a Sisala girl, okay. And you are from the north, so, you know,
yes.
There is this...
yeah, the Sisalas and the
Kasinas
are playmates.
Yes. So I remember very well the moment I got to know she's a Sisala girl, we started our games. And she was born, she grew up down south, so, okay. You know, they're not very... open to the games, but she knew a bit of it, okay. And so it was like teasing her and all of that. But it was subsequently then I said, okay, nah, it seems she's the one. Yes, so
Prof,
that's how it is. Yeah.
It's been an honor.
Thank you.
It's been great talking to you. I wish we can do this again.
Sure.
Maybe next time when you are doing this conference, somewhere in another African country, you take me along.
It will be very nice to actually have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
My guest has been Professor Paul Alagidede. He is a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business Administration, University of Witwatersrand. I hope I get that right. Witwatersrand. Witwatersrand.
Wits for short.
Okay, Wits in South Africa. God willing, we will bring you another exciting discussion on PM Express. Until then, my name is Malik Abbas Dabu. Bye-bye.